I never expected that researching for my new book would turn my life upside down. What started as a quest to understand the human psyche, darker, hidden facets of identity and motivation, led me into an emotional whirlwind I could never have predicted. Sitting in my dimly lit study, pen scratching across the pages, I told myself this is just research. But as the weeks went by, I found myself slipping further into territory I hadn't mapped out, spiraling into feelings that were both thrilling and terrifying. It all began as part of my usual process. My previous books had been largely autobiographical or straightforward fiction, nothing as probing as what I was trying to accomplish with this new project. I wanted to explore human psychology in its most raw, stripped-down form. So when I found Dr. James Harper's name in an online journal, I impulsively reached out, intrigued by his expertise in abnormal psychology and emotional attachment theories. His work had been acclaimed, even controversial at times, as he focused on the darker, obsessive aspects of relationships. Perfect for my story, I convinced myself that working with someone like him would only enhance my characters, making them feel real and layered. Our first meeting was in a small cafe downtown, one of those dimly lit places that held a certain charm. As soon as I saw him, I felt a strange pang in my chest, a combination of nerves and a flicker of intrigue. He was compelling in a subtle way. Maybe it was the intensity of his gaze, those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through you, or the quiet confidence in his movements. When we shook hands, his grip was firm yet gentle. A moment passed as our eyes met, and I quickly brushed it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. Dr. Harper was direct yet attentive, his voice calm and controlled. Over the soft hum of cafe chatter, he explained his work to me, diving into complex psychological theories with ease. As he spoke, I found myself captivated, hanging on to his every word. He had an uncanny ability to make the abstract feel tangible, grounding concepts in real-life examples that were both fascinating and slightly unnerving. We discussed obsession, attachment, and the psychological scars that love and betrayal could leave on a person. People are shaped by what they desire, he said, his voice low and hypnotic, but often they're unaware of just how deeply those desires run. His words lingered in the air, almost like a warning, but I was too engrossed to heed it. By the time we finished our coffee, I was more inspired than I had been in months. I left the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose, and a tiny, inexplicable ache. Our meetings became regular, once a week at first, but as I delved deeper into the novel, I found myself reaching out to him more often. First, it was strictly professional. I would call with specific questions, and he would respond, his answers concise yet thought-provoking. But soon our conversations drifted, becoming less about academic theories and more about everything else. He told me about his life, the trials he'd faced, the people he'd studied who had left an indelible mark on him. He was a closed book slowly opening up, revealing pages I couldn't resist reading. Somewhere along the line, I realized I was no longer simply collecting material for my book. I was drawn to him in a way that was unsettling, consuming. It became harder to separate my thoughts about the story from my thoughts about him. I'd catch myself looking forward to our meetings with an eagerness I hadn't felt in years. It was as if he'd pulled me into a world that I didn't know existed, one where attraction and intellect blurred until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The turning point came one evening when we were discussing trauma. He was explaining how certain memories, especially painful ones, can become so deeply embedded that they define a person, shaping every decision they make. I remember watching him as he spoke, the way he seemed to lose himself in his thoughts, as if reliving something personal. And before I could stop myself, I reached out, placing my hand over his. It was a small gesture, fleeting, but the electricity in that touch was undeniable. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment the world around us disappeared. Time slowed, the noises of the cafe fading into nothing. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath hitching. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he held it there, his thumb brushing lightly against mine. The touch was intimate, yet restrained, as if he too was fighting something within himself. In that moment, I realized I was in far deeper than I'd planned. This was no longer about research or the novel. I wanted to understand him, to unravel the mystery that was Dr. James Harper. And as much as I tried to reason with myself, To remind myself of my own life, my commitments, my responsibilities, the attraction only grew stronger. We both knew we were crossing a line, but there was an unspoken understanding between us, a silent agreement to continue. He became my confidant, my muse, my secret. Our connection felt dangerously real, pulling me further from the confines of my marriage, my routine life. My husband noticed the change in me, the late nights spent writing, the way I would drift off into thought during dinner, but he never suspected the reason. I told myself it was just a harmless infatuation, a professional connection that had turned into a close friendship. But deep down I knew better. James and I continued our meetings, our conversations growing more intense, more personal. There was a charged atmosphere between us, a kind of simmering tension that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. Each time I left his office or the cafe, I would replay our conversations, dissecting every look, every subtle gesture, wondering if he felt the same. Then one evening he asked if I wanted to join him for a walk. The air was crisp, the city lights glowing softly in the twilight. We walked in silence for a while, our shoulders occasionally brushing. My heart pounded, the anticipation hanging heavy between us. Finally he stopped, turning to face me. His eyes held a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, as if he too was on the edge of something he couldn't quite control. Before I knew what I was doing, I leaned in, my lips brushing against his. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the boundaries of this strange, undeniable pull between us. But then something snapped and the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more real. I felt my hands trembling as I held on to him, afraid to let go, afraid of what this meant but unable to stop. When we finally broke apart, he looked at me, his gaze filled with a mix of desire and regret. "This isn't what I planned," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Neither did I replied, feeling a pang of guilt mingled with the thrill of crossing that forbidden line. We stood there in silence, the weight of our choices pressing down on us, knowing we'd crossed into something that couldn't easily be undone. I knew I was standing at the edge, that this was a path I couldn't follow without consequences. But in that moment, all I wanted was to lose myself in him, to explore the depths of this connection we'd forged. Consequences be damned. As I walked home that night, my mind was a chaotic mess of emotions. Guilt, exhilaration, longing. I tried to convince myself that this would be the end of it, that it was just a moment of weakness, a fleeting spark. But deep down I knew it was more than that. I was drawn to him, tethered to him in a way that felt both liberating and terrifying. I had started this journey in search of insight, of depth for my novel, but I had found something far more consuming. It was as if he had become a part of my story, the character I hadn't written but desperately needed. And as much as I tried to pull away, I knew that my heart was no longer my own. After that night, I found myself caught in a current too strong to escape. I tried to convince myself to stop, to tell James we needed to pull back, to refocus on the book, to turn this whole ordeal into nothing more than an intense, but harmless connection that fed into my writing. But the lies I told myself had no power. They were as thin as paper, crumbling the moment I set eyes on him again. James and I continued to meet, though the pretense of research grew increasingly thin. Every encounter felt like stepping into a dream, one in which reality blurred with fantasy, and I felt utterly unmoored. His voice, his words, the way he looked at me. It was as though he saw straight into my soul, exposing every raw, vulnerable part of myself that I usually kept hidden, even from my husband. I started to dread going home, fearing the moment I'd have to put on my mask again and pretend that I was still the same woman I'd been just a few months earlier. My husband was kind, attentive in the ways he had always been, but I saw him with new eyes. Every joke, every gentle touch, every word he said felt like a reminder of the life I was betraying. I hated myself for it, yet I couldn't seem to resist the pull toward James. I told myself that maybe this would pass, that it was just a phase, a strange attraction, a crush that would eventually dissipate. But it didn't. Instead, it consumed me. One afternoon, James and I met in his office. He had been sharing stories of patients he'd treated, stories he knew would fascinate me, inspire my novel. He told me about a woman who had led a double life for years, one filled with secrecy and passion, while maintaining a seemingly perfect marriage. I was entranced by the story, feeling a strange, bitter irony in hearing it. I asked him how she had managed to keep the facade up for so long. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and said, "Some people find a way to live with their secrets, as if they're wearing two skins, one for the world, one for themselves." His words lingered in the air, resonating deep within me, making my heart ache. I felt as if he were speaking directly to me, unraveling the truth of what I had become. Our gazes held for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between us. And then, without warning, he leaned forward, brushing his lips against mine. This kiss was different. It wasn't impulsive or desperate. It was filled with a kind of sadness, a knowledge that what we were doing was wrong yet inevitable. It was the kind of kiss that shattered walls, that laid everything bare. When we finally parted, he took a step back, his face etched with conflict. "I don't want to hurt you," he murmured, his voice strained. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "Then don't," I whispered, though I knew the simplicity of the words held no truth. We were both already hurt, wounded by this thing between us that neither of us could fully understand, yet neither could walk away from. The walls we tried to build between us had crumbled, and I knew that my life was no longer within my control. As the weeks went on, I lived two lives, each one slowly overtaking the other. My husband became a shadow in my mind, a distant part of my reality that felt almost foreign, like a memory of someone I once loved but had drifted away from. I told myself I should stop, that I should end things with James before they spiraled further out of control. But every time I tried, I found myself incapable of pulling away. The thrill, the forbidden nature of it, the connection we shared. It felt addictive, like a drug I couldn't quit. James became the center of my world. He inspired me, challenged me, made me question everything I had believed about love, loyalty, and the lines between right and wrong. With him, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. My writing, too, took on a life of its own, fueled by the passion and complexity of what we shared. My characters became more vivid, their struggles mirroring my own, until I could hardly tell where my story ended and my life began. One evening, as we lay tangled in the sheets of his apartment, he turned to me, his eyes soft, vulnerable in a way that took me by surprise. "Do you ever think about leaving it all behind?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I knew what he was asking, the weight of those words pressing down on me. The idea terrified me. Leaving my husband, my life, everything I had built. Yet a part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to say yes. I wanted to be with James, to live a life where I didn't have to hide, didn't have to pretend. But I also knew that leaving my husband would shatter him, and that thought filled me with an overwhelming sense of guilt. "I don't know," I replied, my voice trembling. "I don't think it's that simple." He nodded, his expression filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "It never is," he said softly, running a hand through my hair. We lay there in silence, the weight of our choices pressing down on us. In that moment, I wished that things were different, that we could be together without the pain, the lies, the betrayal. But life wasn't a story, and the consequences of our actions were all too real. Days turned into weeks, and the line between my two lives grew blurrier. My husband began to notice the distance between us, the way I seemed preoccupied, as if my mind were elsewhere. He would ask if I was okay, if there was something I wanted to talk about, but I would brush him off, giving vague reassurances that everything was fine. I hated myself for the deception, for the way I had allowed my heart to stray so far from the life we had built together. Yet I couldn't stop. One night, as I sat alone in my study trying to write, I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness wash over me. I looked around the room, at the books lining the shelves, the familiar smell of coffee and old paper, and I realized that everything I had once loved felt hollow. My life, my marriage, even my writing, it all felt like a shadow of what it had been. The only thing that felt real was my connection with James, and yet even that was tainted by guilt and secrecy. I felt tears streaming down my face as I struggled to come to terms with the reality of my situation. I was living a lie, trapped between two worlds, unable to fully commit to either. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but the thought of losing James felt like a wound I wasn't sure I could bear. The next day, I met him in the same cafe where we had first met. I could tell from the look in his eyes that he knew something was different. We sat in silence for a long time, the air thick with unspoken words. I can't do this anymore. I whispered, my voice breaking. I can't keep lying, can't keep pretending that this isn't tearing me apart. He reached across the table, taking my hand in his expression filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. I understand, he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. We sat there for what felt like hours, holding hands, saying nothing. And in that silence I felt the weight of everything we had shared. The moments of joy, the laughter, the passion, and the heartache. I knew that ending things with him would break me, but staying would break me even more. When we finally parted, I felt a hollow ache in my chest, as if a part of me had been ripped away. I walked home in a daze, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I had lost something precious, something that had brought me to life in a way I hadn't known was possible. In the days that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my life, to rebuild the walls that had crumbled around me. I focused on my writing, pouring my pain, my guilt, my longing into the pages of my novel. The story became my salvation, a way to process the emotions that threatened to consume me. And as I wrote, I found a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the choices I had made. But a part of me would always carry the memory of James, a scar that would never fully heal. I knew that I would never forget him, never forget the way he had made me feel, the way he had challenged me, inspired me, and ultimately broken me. And though the pain of our parting still lingered, I also knew that I had learned something invaluable about myself, about love, and about the power of connection. In the end, the story I had written was no longer just fiction. It was a reflection of the journey I had taken, the choices I had made, and the heartbreak I had endured. And as I looked at the finished manuscript, I felt a sense of closure, a bittersweet reminder of the man who had changed my life, and the love that would remain forever etched in my heart. The days turned into weeks, and the void James left behind felt vast and inescapable. Each morning I woke up to an empty ache, an absence I couldn't fill, no matter how hard I tried. My husband had noticed the shift in me, of course. He'd felt the emotional distance widening between us even before my affair. But now, with James gone, the emptiness was even more profound. I couldn't shake the sense of something missing, something unfinished, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. I had walked away from James because I'd thought it was the only way to preserve my marriage, to salvage something real from the wreckage I'd created. But in doing so, I'd lost a part of myself I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. I threw myself into my writing, obsessively reworking scenes, rewriting chapters, losing myself in the world of my characters as if that could somehow make the pain go away. The novel had taken on a life of its own, dark and complex, a story of love and betrayal that felt raw and unfiltered, as if I were pouring my soul onto the page. The characters had started out as fictional constructs, yet now they felt deeply personal, echoing my own emotions, my own struggles. Writing became my only release, the one place where I could confront the whirlwind of feelings I couldn't express anywhere else. But even as I wrote, I couldn't escape the memories. Every scene, every line, every passage seemed haunted by James's presence. I would sit at my desk late into the night, my heart racing as I remembered the touch of his hand, the way his eyes held mine, the gentleness in his voice when he whispered to me. I found myself rereading our old messages, replaying our conversations in my mind, searching for some hint of closure that I knew I would never find. One evening, my husband confronted me. He'd been watching me from across the dinner table, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness that broke my heart. "Emily," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I've lost you. You're here but you're not really here. What's going on?" I felt a surge of guilt wash over me, twisting in my chest. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. How could I explain to him the depth of what I had felt for James, the intensity of the connection that had consumed me? How could I tell him about the emptiness that lingered, the feeling that I was only half alive without the man who had come into my life so unexpectedly and left such a deep mark? I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I've just been overwhelmed. With the book, with everything. I don't know how to explain it." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His touch was gentle, familiar, comforting, and yet it felt distant, like a memory of something I had once cherished but now struggled to hold on to. "I know writing is important to you," he said, his tone soft and understanding. "But I miss you, Emily. I miss us." His words cut through me, a painful reminder of everything I had risked, everything I had lost in my pursuit of something that had, ultimately, left me broken and alone. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything, to let him see the raw, vulnerable parts of myself that I had hidden away. But fear held me back, the fear of losing him, of destroying the life we had built together, of shattering the illusion of normalcy I had so carefully maintained. Instead, I squeezed his hand, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I miss us too," I lied, hoping he couldn't see the pain behind my words. But he did. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, a mixture of sadness and resignation, as if he already knew the truth but was waiting for me to say it out loud. In the days that followed, I tried to bridge the gap between us, to rekindle the intimacy we had once shared. We went on dates, took long walks, spent quiet evenings at home, trying to recapture the sense of closeness that had once come so naturally. But it was like trying to hold water in my hands. The harder I tried, the more it slipped away. Every moment with him felt like a reminder of the life I had lost, the life I had destroyed with my own choices. One night, as we lay in bed, my husband fast asleep beside me, I found myself reaching for my phone, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through old messages from James. The urge to see him, to hear his voice, to feel his touch one more time was overwhelming, a craving that gnawed at me, refusing to fade. I typed out a message: "I miss you. I can't stop thinking about you." My finger hovered over the send button, my heart pounding. But at the last second I stopped, my mind racing with guilt and shame. What was I doing? I had made my choice. I had chosen to stay, to rebuild my life, to repair the damage I had caused. Yet here I was, still clinging to the ghost of a man who had left me in pieces. I deleted the message, my chest tight with frustration and longing. I knew I couldn't go back to him, couldn't reopen that wound. But the ache remained, a constant reminder of the love I had lost and the emptiness that lingered in its wake. In the months that followed, I poured everything I had into my novel. The story became a mirror of my own struggles, my own heartbreak, a reflection of the choices I had made, and the consequences that had followed. The characters felt like extensions of myself, fragments of my own soul laid bare on the page. Writing became my therapy, my salvation, my way of processing the pain that I couldn't express in words. When I finally finished the manuscript, I felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifted from my shoulders. It was done. The story was complete, a testament to the love I had lost, the choices I had made, and the pain I had endured. It was raw, honest, filled with a vulnerability I hadn't known I was capable of. And yet, as I looked at the finished pages, I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a sense of finality that left me feeling both free and utterly alone. I handed the manuscript to my publisher, bracing myself for the response. The story was darker, more personal than anything I had ever written, a departure from my usual style. I wasn't sure how it would be received, whether readers would understand the depth of emotion that had gone into every word. But a part of me didn't care. This book was for me, a way to confront the mistakes I had made, the love I had lost, and the woman I had become. The book was published a few months later, and to my surprise, it was met with praise and acclaim. Readers connected with the story, with the raw honesty of the characters, with the intensity of the emotions that I had poured onto the page. They saw themselves in the story, in the choices and regrets, in the longing and heartbreak. The novel became a bestseller, a success beyond anything I had anticipated. Yet, despite the accolades, the interviews, the praise from critics and fans, I felt a lingering sense of emptiness. One evening at a book signing event, I was approached by a woman who looked at me with tears in her eyes. She held a copy of my book, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for writing this. I've been through something similar, and reading your story, it helped me feel less alone." Her words struck a chord deep within me, a reminder of the power of connection, of the shared experiences that bind us together. I had poured my soul into that book, and in doing so I had reached others, had touched lives in ways I hadn't expected. It was a small comfort, a reminder that my pain had not been in vain. As I drove home that night, I found myself thinking about James, about the love we had shared, the intensity of our connection, the way he had changed me. I knew I would never fully let go of him, that a part of me would always carry the memory of what we had shared. But I also knew that I had grown, had come to understand myself in ways I never could have without him. In the end, life went on. I rebuilt my marriage slowly, carefully, piece by piece. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but there was a new honesty between us, a willingness to face our flaws, to confront the parts of ourselves we had hidden away. My husband and I found a way forward, a path that was filled with forgiveness and understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time I felt a sense of peace. And as I sat at my desk, pen in hand, ready to start my next novel, I realized that the story of James and me was not one of regret, but of transformation. He had been a chapter in my life, a chapter filled with passion, pain, and growth. And though that chapter had ended, it had shaped me in ways I would carry with me forever. In that quiet moment, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began to write again, ready to turn the page and embrace whatever came next. As I sat down to begin my next novel, I found myself staring at the blank page, a rare silence in my mind. Usually words flowed quickly, ideas tumbling out as if they had been waiting impatiently to be captured. But this time I felt a strange stillness, a sense of emptiness that I couldn't explain. The success of my last book had been extraordinary, but it had taken everything I had to write it. I had poured every raw, unfiltered emotion onto those pages, leaving parts of myself behind in a story that was both fictional and deeply personal. And now I wasn't sure what was left. Weeks passed and I found myself slipping into a familiar routine, one I hadn't anticipated. Each morning I would sit at my desk, hoping inspiration would strike, only to end the day with nothing but scattered notes and half-formed ideas. The book tour had come and gone, the excitement fading, leaving only the echo of James's memory, lingering in the corners of my mind. The novel had brought me a measure of closure, but there were moments when memories of him would resurface unexpectedly, driving past a familiar cafe, the scent of his cologne on a stranger in passing, a line in a book that reminded me of something he had said. I had thought that writing our story would put it behind me, that I would move forward as I rebuilt my life. But the truth was his presence lingered like a shadow, just out of reach but never truly gone. One rainy afternoon, as I sat alone in my study, the sound of raindrops pattering against the window, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: "Congratulations on the book." My heart stopped for a moment, my hand frozen on the mouse. I opened the email, barely breathing as I read, "Dear Emily, I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you. I know what it took to write that story, to lay everything bare like that. It's a rare gift, and you've touched more people than you realize. Your words have power. Don't ever doubt that. With admiration, James." I felt my hands shaking, my heart racing as I read the message again and again. He had read my book. He had seen the truth hidden within the words, had recognized the pain, the longing, the love that I had tried so desperately to capture. It was a quiet, simple email, but it felt like a lifeline, a reminder that he was still out there, that our connection hadn't disappeared even if we had parted ways. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my mind flooded with emotions I hadn't felt in months. Part of me wanted to respond, to reach out and tell him everything I had kept bottled up. But I knew that wasn't possible. I had made my choice. I had walked away for a reason. Responding would only reopen wounds that had only just begun to heal. So I left the email unanswered, letting it sit in my inbox like a quiet reminder of the chapter one had closed. But from that day on, I felt a shift within me. It was as if his words had rekindled something, a spark that had been smothered by guilt and regret. I began to write again, slowly, tentatively, letting the words flow without questioning them. I didn't know where the story was going or what it would become, but I wrote with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The story that emerged was different from anything I had written before. It was quieter, more introspective, a journey of self-discovery and healing. There were no grand dramas, no intense love affairs, only a woman trying to understand herself, to find peace after a period of turmoil. As the pages filled, I felt a weight lifting, as if I were slowly untangling the knots that had held me captive for so long. My husband noticed the change in me, the way I seemed lighter, more present. We had worked hard to rebuild our relationship, to find a new rhythm that acknowledged the scars of the past without letting them define us. There were still moments of tension, moments when I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a reminder of the betrayal that had nearly destroyed us. But over time, those moments grew fewer, replaced by a quiet understanding, a mutual commitment to moving forward. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, he turned to me, a soft smile on his face. "I'm glad you're writing again," he said, his voice gentle. I smiled back, feeling a warmth in my chest that hadn't been there for a long time. "Me too. Feels different this time. Like I'm finally writing for myself." He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I can see that. You seem happier." I looked at him, a swell of gratitude filling me. He had stood by me through everything, had chosen to stay even when it would have been easier to walk away. I knew I was lucky, knew that not everyone would have been as forgiving, as willing to rebuild what had been broken. And in that moment, I realized that I loved him in a way that went beyond passion or excitement. It was a love that was quiet, steady, rooted in understanding and acceptance. Over the next few months, life began to take on a new rhythm. I finished my novel, feeling a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't felt in years. The story was different from my last book, quieter, more introspective, but it was mine, a testament to the journey I had taken, the growth I had experienced. It was a story about healing, about forgiveness, about finding peace in the aftermath of chaos. The novel was well received, though not with the same fervor as my last one. Readers called it thought-provoking and introspective, and I received letters from people who said the story had touched them, had made them reflect on their own lives, their own choices. It was a quieter success, but it felt more authentic, more grounded. And for the first time in a long time, I felt content. One day, as I was sorting through some old papers, I came across a photograph of James and me, taken during one of our early meetings. We were seated across from each other in a cafe, both of us laughing, our faces lit up with the excitement of discovery, of connection. I felt a pang of nostalgia, a bittersweet ache that reminded me of everything we had shared. But as I looked at the photo, I realized that the pain had softened, had transformed into something gentler, a memory that I could cherish without feeling the sharp sting of regret. I kept the photo, tucking it into a drawer along with other mementos from that time. It was a part of my story, a chapter that had shaped me in ways I couldn't deny. But it was just that, a chapter. A part of my past, a part of who I had been but no longer who I was. As the years passed, life continued to unfold in quiet, unexpected ways. My husband and I grew closer, our love deepening into something solid and enduring, a bond that was rooted in the trials we had overcome together. My writing flourished, each new novel reflecting a different part of my journey, a different stage of growth and understanding. And though I never saw James again, he remained a part of me, a reminder of a time when I had been lost, searching for something I hadn't been able to name. Looking back, I realized that meeting him had been a catalyst, a spark that had ignited a period of transformation, of self-discovery. He had shown me parts of myself that I hadn't known existed, had challenged me in ways that had forced me to confront my own weaknesses, my own desires. And for that I was grateful. In the end, life was a series of chapters, each one building upon the last, each one shaping us into the people we were meant to become. And as I sat down to write the next chapter of my life, I felt a quiet sense of peace, a deep acceptance of everything that had brought me to this moment. The pain, the love, the loss, it had all been part of a journey that had led me to a place of understanding, of forgiveness, of grace. And so, with a steady hand and an open heart, I turned the page and began to write anew, ready to embrace whatever came next. Years passed, seasons came and went, and with each one, I felt myself settling deeper into the life I had almost lost. My husband and I had rebuilt our marriage on a foundation stronger than before, though its strength had been tested by fire. We learned to be honest with each other in ways we hadn't dared to be before, sharing our fears and dreams with an openness that felt unfamiliar but necessary. We had crossed through a landscape of pain together, and emerged with a respect that was quieter but more profound than what we'd started with. And though I still felt the echoes of the past, they no longer haunted me. They were gentle, softened memories that had shaped who I had become. As my career continued to flourish, my books began to take on new themes. My writing had evolved, too, moving away from the darker, complex tales of heartbreak and obsession to something softer and more reflective. The characters I created were no longer tormented by unfulfilled desires or trapped in webs of regret. They were people searching for peace, for purpose, for redemption. And in each story there was a sliver of my own journey, hidden between the lines, a quiet testimony to the struggles and transformations I had endured. My life with my husband had developed into a rhythm that felt comfortable, even joyful. We traveled together, explored new places, discovered new passions, and revisited old dreams. There were times, of course, when the shadows of the past crept in, moments when I'd catch him looking at me with an expression of quiet reflection, as if he were remembering what we'd almost lost. But those moments no longer brought sadness or regret. They were reminders of how far we had come, how much we had fought to keep what we had. One summer evening, as we sat in our garden, surrounded by the scent of blooming jasmine, he turned to me with a look that took me by surprise. "Emily," he said softly, reaching for my hand, "I just want you to know that I wouldn't change anything. Not one thing." I felt a lump rise in my throat, the weight of his words settling over me like a gentle balm. We had never spoken so openly about the affair, about the choices we had made, the heartache we had survived. But in that moment I understood what he was saying. He wasn't just forgiving me, he was embracing the journey we had taken together, the lessons we had learned, the growth we had achieved. "I wouldn't either," I replied, my voice trembling. And as we sat there, hands intertwined, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a deep, abiding sense of gratitude for this second chance, for the life we had reclaimed, for the love that had endured. With time, even my memories of James softened, shifting from the intense longing and regret I had once felt to something almost peaceful. It was as if he had become a character in my mind, a figure who had once been central to my story, but who now existed in a different realm. A quiet, sacred place in my memory. I no longer felt the sting of loss when I thought of him. Instead, I felt a kind of reverence for the role he had played in my life. He had been both a blessing and a lesson, a teacher who had shown me parts of myself I hadn't known existed. And though I would never see him again, I knew that he was part of me, woven into the fabric of who I had become. As the years continued to pass, I began to notice subtle changes in my writing too. My stories no longer carried the same intensity of inner conflict and unrequited desire. Instead, they explored themes of reconciliation, of healing, of finding beauty in unexpected places. Readers responded to this shift, and I received letters from people who told me that my books had helped them find peace in their own lives, had given them hope in moments of despair. Each letter was a reminder that my work had meaning, that my journey had value beyond my own personal growth. One day, while I was cleaning out an old box of papers, I stumbled upon the photograph of James and me, the one from the cafe, our faces lit with laughter and discovery. For a long time I sat there staring at the picture, remembering the way he had made me feel, the thrill of our connection, the sense of freedom and possibility that had sparked between us. But this time I felt no pain, no regret, only a quiet acceptance, a gentle gratitude for the chapter we had shared. Without overthinking it, I took the photograph and placed it inside a notebook, pressing it between the pages. It would be there, quietly preserved, a testament to a moment in time that had shaped my life in ways I could never have anticipated. And then I closed the notebook and set it aside, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't felt before. I didn't need to revisit those memories anymore. They had served their purpose, and I was ready to let them rest. As the years went by, life settled into a beautiful simplicity. My husband and I grew older together, our love deepening in ways that were quiet but profound. We experienced joys and challenges, faced losses and celebrated triumphs. And through it all, our bond remained steadfast, a reminder of the resilience of love, of its ability to endure even the most testing of trials. One autumn afternoon, as we strolled through a park, surrounded by the golden hues of fallen leaves, he stopped and looked at me with a warmth in his eyes that took me by surprise. "You're happy, aren't you?" he asked softly, a small smile playing at his lips. I smiled back, feeling the truth of his words resonate within me. I was happy, perhaps not in the way I had imagined happiness would feel when I was younger, not with the fire and intensity of passion, but with a quiet, steady contentment that felt truer, more real. It was a happiness born of acceptance, of forgiveness, of understanding the beauty in imperfection. "Yes," I replied, squeezing his hand. "I am." We continued walking, the leaves crunching beneath our feet, the cool autumn breeze brushing against our faces. And in that moment I felt a sense of peace that went beyond words. A peace that came from knowing that I had lived fully, had loved deeply, and had found my way through the darkness to a place of light. And so as I looked out at the world around me, at the beauty of the changing seasons, at the life I had built with a man who had stood by me through it all, I knew that my story was far from over. There would be new chapters, new challenges, new lessons to learn. But for the first time I felt ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength, the wisdom, and the courage to face it. The past, with all its twists and turns, had shaped me into the woman I was, and I felt a deep gratitude for every moment, every heartbreak, every joy. It had been a journey filled with unexpected detours and painful lessons, but it had brought me to a place of true contentment, a place where I could look back with forgiveness and look forward with hope. And as I held my husband's hand, feeling the warmth of his presence beside me, I knew that this was enough. This life, with all its beauty and imperfection, was everything I needed. And with that thought I felt a quiet, profound sense of joy, a joy that had been years in the making, a joy that was all the more precious for the trials that had led me to it. In the end, life was a journey, a series of stories woven together in ways we could never predict. And as I continued on my path, I knew that each moment, each choice, each love and loss was a part of the story that was uniquely mine. A story that was at last whole. As the years continued to unfold, I found myself reflecting more and more on the nature of love, on the many forms it takes and the quiet ways it transforms us. Life, I realized, was not a single story but a collection of many stories woven together, each one layered upon the last, creating a rich tapestry that was as complex as it was beautiful. My marriage became something of an anchor for me, a safe harbor in a world that seemed to change faster with each passing year. The passion that had once defined my relationship with my husband had shifted into something gentler, more enduring. We had created a bond that was rooted in respect and friendship as much as it was in love, a connection that had weathered storms and come through stronger on the other side. With each passing season, my husband and I found new ways to appreciate each other, to rediscover the joy in our shared life. We began to travel more, exploring places we had only dreamed of visiting in our youth. We walked through the bustling streets of Paris, the ancient ruins of Rome, the sun-drenched vineyards of Tuscany. Each trip was a reminder of how vast and beautiful the world was, and how much there was still to discover, both outside ourselves and within. Our travels brought us closer, each experience adding new layers to our relationship. There was something magical about exploring unfamiliar places together, about being strangers in a new land and discovering it side by side. The world felt full of wonder, and in those moments, I was reminded of the joy of simply being alive, of sharing these fleeting moments with someone who had become as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. Over time, I realized that my husband had become my best friend in a way that was different from the romantic love that had first drawn us together. He was the person who knew me better than anyone else, who understood my fears and dreams without me having to speak them out loud. We could sit in comfortable silence for hours, simply enjoying each other's presence, and it felt as fulfilling as any grand adventure. Yet, despite the peace I had found, there were still moments when memories of James would surface unexpectedly, catching me off guard. It would happen at the most unexpected times, when I was working on a new novel, or walking alone in a park, or even in the quiet moments just before sleep claimed me. His memory lingered like a faint perfume, a reminder of a time when I had been a different person, consumed by a love that was both exhilarating and impossible. At first, these memories would fill me with a bittersweet ache, a longing for something that could never be. But as the years went on, I found that even these memories softened, transforming from pangs of regret into something gentler. James had been a part of my journey, a catalyst for change, a mirror that had shown me parts of myself I hadn't known existed. And though I would never see him again, I had come to a place where I could think of him without pain, only gratitude. My writing continued to evolve, reflecting the shifts within me. Each book felt like a new chapter in my own journey, an exploration of the themes that had come to define my life. Forgiveness, resilience, the beauty of finding peace in the aftermath of turmoil. My stories no longer carried the same intensity of heartbreak and longing that had once been their hallmark. Instead, they were infused with a sense of calm, of acceptance, of the quiet joy that comes from embracing life as it is. Readers noticed the change, and many reached out to tell me that my books had helped them find solace in their own struggles, that they had seen themselves in the characters I created. I received letters from people who had been through their own heartaches, who had experienced loss and betrayal, and who found comfort in the journeys my characters undertook. It was a deeply humbling experience to know that my words could touch lives in such a profound way. I felt as if I had finally found my true voice, a voice that was honest, compassionate, and true. One autumn day, as I was working on a new manuscript, I received a message from my publisher. They were planning a retrospective of my work, a celebration of my career, an acknowledgement of the impact my books had made over the years. The event would include readings from my novels, interviews, and a discussion of the themes that had come to define my writing. I was honored, yet part of me felt a strange trepidation, a reluctance to look back at the journey I had traveled. The night of the event arrived, and I found myself standing in front of a room full of people, some of whom had been following my work for years. As I looked out at the faces in the audience, I felt a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. My novels had been an extension of my soul, each one a reflection of the experiences, the heartbreaks, the moments of joy that had shaped my life. It was as if I were laying bare my innermost self, allowing strangers a glimpse into the journey that had brought me to this moment. As I spoke about my work, about the themes of love and loss, forgiveness and growth, I felt a calm settle over me. I realized that this event was not just a celebration of my career, but a culmination of the choices I had made, the lives I had touched, the lessons I had learned. It was a moment of closure, a way of honoring the path I had taken, with all its twists and turns. After the event, a young woman approached me, her eyes filled with emotion. She held a copy of my first novel, the one that had launched my career so many years ago. "Your book saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "I was going through a dark time, and your words, they gave me hope. They reminded me that I wasn't alone." I felt a lump form in my throat, the weight of her words settling over me like a blessing. In that moment, I understood the true power of storytelling, the way it could bridge the gap between people, offering comfort and understanding in a world that often felt indifferent. My journey had been a solitary one, filled with moments of doubt and regret, but it had brought me to this moment, to this connection with a stranger who had found solace in my words. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. My life had come full circle, each chapter leading to the next, each experience shaping me in ways I hadn't foreseen. The pain, the love, the choices I had made, they had all been part of a larger story, one that was still unfolding, one that had meaning beyond the surface. In the quiet of my study that night, I sat down and began to write again, not for an audience, not for a publisher, but for myself. It was a story I had carried with me for years, one that had lingered in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to be told. It was a story of a woman who had loved and lost, who had made mistakes and found redemption, who had learned to forgive herself and embrace the beauty of an imperfect life. And as the words filled the page, I felt a quiet joy, a sense of contentment that came from knowing that my journey, with all its highs and lows, had led me here, to this moment of peace, to this place of grace. My life, I realized, was like a novel, filled with unexpected twists, with moments of heartbreak and joy, with characters who had shaped me in ways I could never have predicted. And though I didn't know what the next chapter would hold, I felt ready to face it, knowing that I had the strength, the wisdom, and the resilience to embrace whatever came next. In the end, life was a story, one that we each wrote in our own way. And as I closed my notebook, a sense of profound gratitude filled me, a quiet understanding that every moment, every choice, every love and loss, was part of the journey that had brought me to this place of peace. And with that, I turned off the light, ready to face the dawn of a new chapter. As the years drifted on, I felt the story of my life quietly settle into its final chapters, each day an echo of the choices and experiences that had brought me here. I no longer felt the pull of unresolved emotions, no longer lingered on past mistakes or questioned the what-ifs. Instead, I had found a steady, enduring peace, a calm that came from acceptance, from having lived fully, having dared, faltered, healed, and ultimately grown. My husband and I had grown older together, our bond deepening in ways that surprised me even after decades. There was something remarkable in sharing a life so intimately with someone, in seeing each other's flaws and failings and still choosing each other every day. Our love had softened into something profound and unshakable, a companionship that felt as essential as breathing. We understood each other without words, cherished each day with a quiet gratitude that needed no grand gestures or declarations. We had weathered storms, both together and alone, and come through them with a love that was stronger for its imperfections. My writing, too, had shifted. I found myself drawn less to the complex dramas of human frailty and more to the subtleties of human resilience, the quiet bravery of living through heartache, the grace of forgiving oneself, the beauty of finding love, even in the simplest of moments. My stories became reflections of the life I had led, each one a small tribute to the strength and vulnerability it took to be human. My readers, many of whom had followed my journey since the beginning, often told me that my books brought them comfort, that my words resonated with them in ways that made them feel seen. It was a gift beyond anything I could have imagined, knowing that the truths I had uncovered in my own life could touch others so deeply. One summer afternoon, while sorting through some old belongings, I came across the notebook where I had tucked away the photograph of James. I held it in my hands, gazing at the faded image of our younger selves, laughing in that long-ago cafe. There was a softness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed back then, a hint of something that had once seemed mysterious but now felt achingly familiar. He had been a catalyst, a spark that had ignited a transformation within me, but he was no longer a lingering ache or an unresolved memory. Instead, he was simply part of my story, a chapter that had led me to this life, to this love, to this peace. I placed the photograph back in the notebook, feeling a warm, quiet gratitude for that time, for the way it had shaped me. I didn't need to revisit those memories anymore. They had served their purpose. I was whole without them. As the evening drew in, my husband joined me on the porch, his hand finding mine as we watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The world around us was quiet, the hum of life slowing as the day came to a close. I looked over at him, at the lines that had deepened on his face, each one a mark of the years we had shared. And as he looked back at me, his eyes warm and steady, I knew that this quiet, enduring love was the greatest story I had ever written. In that moment, I felt a contentment so complete, it left me breathless. I had found my way through the chaos, the mistakes, the longing, to a place of gentle joy, of unwavering love. My life had not been perfect, nor had it followed the path I had once imagined. But it was a life I had lived fully, one I had chosen each step of the way, and I wouldn't have changed a single moment. As the stars began to appear overhead, I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence beside me. We sat there in comfortable silence, two souls who had found their way to each other again and again, through all the storms and the seasons of life. And as the night settled around us, I knew, with a certainty that filled me to my core, that my story was complete. It was a story of love, of forgiveness, of growth. And it was mine, woven with every joy, every heartbreak, every lesson that had led me here. With a heart full of gratitude, I looked out at the night sky, feeling the quiet peace of a life well lived. And in that beautiful, gentle silence, my story found its perfect ending.